On today's episode, we talk about an episode of Ancient Apocalypse in which Graham Hancock talks about the history of Malta for 30 minutes without talking about the history of Malta. I'm Aidan Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. So perhaps saying that Graham Hancock doesn't talk about the history of Malta isn't quite a 100% accurate statement, but going into episode 3 of Ancient Apocalypse, we spend a lot of time talking about generalizations about the history of Malta. Kind of who was there, not necessarily when they were there, the hands it passed through, but we're really focusing on prehistory. Graham starts by questioning the belief that our own civilization in the 21st century is the apex and the pinnacle of human achievement. He says that he takes issue with this idea because it's conceited and it gives us this image of the past where our ancestors were not as adept, as intelligent, or as capable as we are today. Personally, I don't feel that that's a fair assessment of how historians view people of the past, because for the most part, we look at it and it's, okay, well, these people were intelligent, they were capable, they just didn't possess a lot of the knowledge that we have today, and that's why they were behind us. It's not that they weren't capable of doing things with the information and the knowledge given to them, but rather that they just didn't possess any of it themselves. He goes on to say it hasn't just been a straight line, evolutionary progress from primitive cavemen to anatomically modern humans, saying that we didn't just start in caves and come straight here, there were rises and falls along the way. We reached a period of technological advancement, and then something happened that pushed us back a few centuries, but because we're a resilient and very stubborn species, we kept clawing our way back. And if you're looking at the evolutionary biology perspective of things, he's also not wrong. There's kind of an understanding that, oh, well, we started out as early humans, vaguely different from what we recognize today as apes, and then we ended up step by step getting here. In reality, it seems that there were branches that split off from the main evolutionary tree, and then, some of them died out, some of them managed to continue evolving, and then died out. Humans, of course, are just one of those branches. For a long time, it was believed that Homo sapiens sapiens was the only one that really matched that modern man descriptor. In later years, we figured out that, we're a lot more closely related to Homo sapiens neanderthalensis and the Denisovans than we ever thought before. Of course, Neanderthals and humans only lived side by side for a very brief period of time, a few thousand years, so we're not saying that Neanderthals were the ones starting civilization and we picked up in their footsteps. Instead, Graham is saying that human civilization is probably older than we thought, and he's going to start us with this episode on the island of Malta, or more appropriately, the archipelago of Malta, which forms the country of Malta. Today, Malta is an island nation of about 500,000 people, but despite its very close proximity to Sicily, which is of course an Italian territory, it's not Italian. The official languages of the country are Maltese, which happens to be a Semitic language for reasons we'll get into, and English, which you'll notice neither of those are Romance languages. Ethnically, the entire country is a melting pot. You have cities with names like Valletta right next to towns with names like Pembroke. Personally, the period most interesting to me is 1530 to 1798, when the area was under the control of the Knights Hospitaller, who were of course one of the Crusader orders, and really the only one to survive that long after the Crusades. And interestingly enough, the French were both major allies of the Knights Hospitaller and also the country who eventually conquered Malta and took it from them. Thanks, Napoleon. As for the modern population of the island, it began to take shape in the 11th century after it was conquered by the Normans in 1091. Prior to that, it had undergone a number of depopulation events, some of them caused by agricultural crises, others caused by invasions and plagues. For example, the Arabs, for a little while, took over the island, and we're not entirely sure what happened to it during that time. We just know that when the Normans got there in 1091, it was severely depopulated. Prior to that, however, it had been settled numerous times and desettled numerous times, going as far back as 5900 BC. These people who are believed to be the first settlers of Malta weren't even Europeans. They were the pre-European population of Europe. But the crux of this episode is that Graham believes that it might have had a permanent settled population long before that. He says that the early inhabitants, as far as the mainstream is concerned, were Stone Age Neolithic farmers from the island of Sicily, which for a time was connected by a land bridge to Malta, but by the time of 5900, these people would have been coming over on rafts or boats. This part is confirmed by Katja Stroud of Heritage Malta, although Katja later came out and did say she took issue with the way in which she was presented in the show, and that it made her out to seem like she was agreeing with certain stuff that she does not actually agree with, mostly in relation to astronomy and how the temple complexes on Malta were related to the stars. But she did agree that the first people to come to Malta came there in 5900 BC, and that they brought over with them the first domesticated farm animals and likely the first domesticated plants. And then we get to the part where Graham really begins to challenge the narrative, which is that he says that for a period of several thousand years, from 5900 BC to about 3600 BC, they just didn't really do anything there. They didn't build any megalithic structures, and then one day they just woke up and built what is called Gigantia. Gigantia is an ancient and fairly large temple complex located on the island of Gozo, which is the northwestern island of the Maltese archipelago. And up until the discovery of Göbekli Tepe, it was believed that Gigantia was the oldest freestanding structure in the world. Göbekli Tepe, of course, predates Gigantia by about 6,000 years. And walking around the ruins, Graham says that he feels like a dwarf standing among the works of giants. He says the construction of these walls required the lifting of hundreds of massive megaliths, some weighing up to 50 tons. Now, according to Graham, Gigantia was originally the height of a 3-story house. Its outer walls were constructed of massive stacked stones, and the interior would have been painted red. I guess they got this from the pigmentation that is actually on the walls. He also notes the discovery of charred animal bones, which suggests that they were doing some form of either feasting or ritual sacrifice at these sites. Gigantia, of course, is believed to have probably been dedicated to a fertility goddess due to a number of dolls that were found there, little clay and stone dolls. But then he goes on to say that there are no written sources and no reliable carbon dates for the specific complex of Gigantia. And he's correct that there are no written sources because we're looking back thousands and thousands of years, even before you had the Phoenician alphabet and at the early stages of hieroglyphics. In his opinion, this begs the question, how old is that temple complex really? So first, let's pause to go over all of that information. Some information was left out of this, which is the actual type of stone used to construct Gigantia, as well as any source for the 50-ton thing. I've yet to find an academic source confirming 50 tons, so I went and I did the math myself, and what I found was that these are constructed of limestone, and in order for a limestone block to weigh 50 tons, it would have to have certain dimensions. Specifically, it would need to be about 19.76 meters cubed to weigh that much. And there are some blocks on the very bottom, the foundation level, that do look like they could match those dimensions. So I'm not going to argue and say that there's no chance that they're 50 tons. That's a big rock. The charred bones, on the other hand, are recognized by archaeologists, but they're not sure of the exact purpose. It could be sacrificial rituals, it could be feasting, and it could be divination. There's any number of things that you might char animals for. But as for the carbon dating claim, that one's a little odd to me. I don't totally agree with that. I found numerous sources that talked about carbon dating being carried out. I found academic studies about carbon dating being carried out. And from what I can tell, a not insignificant amount of carbon dating has in fact been carried out, not just at Gigantia, but across the Maltese Islands altogether. Graham goes on to say that the sole reason that archaeologists claim Gigantia was built around 5,600 years ago is that some artifacts found in the area match those of other much simpler sites dated to that period. That's technically true in that the artifacts do match those simpler structures from the same time period, but it's not true to say that we have no carbon dates from Gigantia. We do have a limited sample of carbon dates from Gigantia, including charred bones and charred seeds. You could argue that just because that's a small sample size, that makes it an unreliable sample, but it also shows that it's not the artifacts matching is not the sole reason that archaeologists date it to this period. They do have some carbon dated samples. So Graham's point is to suggest that just because these artifacts that we're finding are a certain age doesn't necessarily mean that the structure itself can't be older. And that's fair because humans have many, many times occupied and repurposed various sites built by other previous civilizations for their own use. So could the artifacts have been left there at a later date? Because Graham makes the rather bold claim that none of the prehistory of Malta stacks up. He goes on to ask, Could these farmers, who archaeologists tell us never built anything bigger than a shack, really have achieved all this? And this shows a pretty serious flaw in Graham's argument, which is the suggestion that there was no evolution here whatsoever. Gigantia is the oldest temple complex on the island, but it's not the oldest cultural site on the island. Again, to be fair, that doesn't prove that Gigantia was only built 5,600 years ago, but it does show that there was cultural progression and evolution leading up to it being built. As for the shack comment, he's not entirely wrong. There's not a ton of evidence of what the Maltese were living in, how they were constructing their own homes, so they probably weren't made of stone, and they were probably pretty simple. But the thing is, that's not particularly unusual, even going into the early Bronze Age. You see a lot of buildings that are, the ones that are really culturally important, temples and things like that, they're going to be built out of stone first, while the average person is probably going to live in a house made of wood or clay, something like that. And of course, clay is pretty brittle and wood rots, so those things aren't necessarily going to be left over after all this time. You have pottery, because pottery shards are small. Preserving an entire clay home probably not going to work out very well. But this really isn't the issue at the core of the episode, because Graham seems to be claiming, in fact is claiming, that Gigantia wasn't built by the people we recognize as the prehistoric Maltese at all. Rather, it was built a long time before that, and those people came in and found those temples. That feels familiar. To Graham's credit, this is nowhere near as inane as the Tartaria stuff. But at this point, Graham shifts gears, and he goes more into talking about folklore because it has to do with that temple complex itself. And the story he tells is one of a giantess or a goddess named Sansuna. Sansuna marries or procreates, at the very least, with a common man of the island, a human being. They have a half-giant, half-man son, and while carrying that half-man, half-giant child, she constructs the temple at Gigantia, and that's where she goes on to worship. According to legend, this all happened in just one day, the building of the temple. And as part of this, he recalls in another episode, the episode prior, where he talked about how the Neanderthal had their own similar versions of these myths involving giants building temples, but as we touched on in the previous episode of this series, he has those stories kind of wrong. He gets the story of Quetzalcoatl pretty wrong, and then also there's the fact that the Neanderthal aren't the people who built the Great Pyramid at Cholula. That was a previous civilization that they actually conquered. So there's some issues with using that as a linchpin for this argument. As for Sansuna's size, Graham is very clear with us that he does not believe that giants ever roamed the earth, at least not physical giants that towered over us. Rather, he asks the question, what if Sansuna was in fact a giant of intellect, much the same way he talked about some of those Mexica myths? But my issue with this isn't any retelling of the story being wrong or a misattribution of this story as being similar to something else. It's rather the dating, because there's no evidence that this story goes back to the original Maltese population. In fact, the word Sansuna is a Semitic term, and it's very, very certain that the original people who lived on Malta, the people who built Gigantia, were not a Semitic people, not even a little bit. From 800 to 700 BC, there was a wave of Phoenician colonization, and then the island came under the control of Carthage later on. And then, of course, much, much later, there was also an Arab push into Malta. So that's two different Semitic language cultural groups who could have brought Sansuna with them. Additionally, Sansuna seems to be the female form of the word Samson. So this could also be a much later story that would have been brought in by the Arabs that would have had to do with the Jewish Old Testament. And that's not to say that that's definitive or we know where the Sansuna legend originated, but from what I can tell, there's really no good evidence that it originated with Gigantia. And when you consider that there were multiple places where the Romans had pulled out of, that the Romans had left and been subsumed by other nations, and people back then thought that Roman constructions were built by giants as well, in some cases, that's kind of overplayed in the media, but there were times and places where people thought, oh my god, these buildings must have been built by a race of giants. And they didn't have nearly the amount of time in between. Graham does say that it could just be a legend, though, and he then moves us along to another piece of evidence. And I want to stop here and say that this is something I do appreciate about Graham, which is that he's making a persuasive argument. He is trying to convince you that he is right, but he also does step back often and say, it could just be a legend, and he gives himself room to be wrong. He's also shown the ability to change his opinions, as we see with him thinking that crustal displacement was responsible for whatever destroyed Atlantis, so to speak, and then changing that over to the impact theory. after the discovery of the Younger Dryas impact and the more research that was done into Meltwater Pulse 1b. And he brings up that prior to Meltwater Pulse 1b, Malta was not always an island. For a long time, especially during the last glacial maximum, Malta was connected to Sicily and then to Italy via just land bridges. That was a much larger terranean space, terrestrial space. And it's actually not just Malta. There was a period of time at which you could walk from Orkney all the way down to Malta. Probably would have taken you a while, but you could do it. For those unfamiliar with Meltwater Pulse 1b, we covered it in the previous video, but I'll give you the quick rundown here, which is around 11,600 years ago, as part of a series of meltwater pulses, Meltwater Pulse 1b occurred, and what happened there was that you had something caused a lot of glaciers to melt very rapidly, and the sea levels rose by about 25 meters over the course of just 100 years, for a total of 60 meters over the course of about 1,000 years. So this would have been a pretty substantial flooding event for any coastal regions. And again, for more details on that, the last video, it covers it, it cites sources and everything. I'm not pulling that out of my ass, don't worry. But it seems like in Graham's opinion, the people who built Gigantia got to Malta around 11,600 years ago, and probably even before that. Graham notes that Ice Age era animals did make it to Malta. We do have their fossils. We do know they were there. And so it only makes sense that humans, seeking warmer weather and better game, would have continued to follow them across those land bridges. This is also bolstered by the fact that we do have evidence of very, very early humans in Sicily. And the idea here is that people then would have returned to Malta thousands of years later, found the buildings already there, and just started to use them. And he goes on to say, the problem is, archaeologists claim there's simply no evidence of any species of humans on Malta from that long ago. It's a bit more nuanced than that. So Graham brings in Maltese pediatrician and amateur historian Dr. Anton Mifsud. What they tell us is that in a cave called Gar Dalam, one of the oldest sites with human habitation on the entire archipelago, they found a very intriguing piece of evidence for the island's early human past. What happened was that in 1917, a team of archaeologists working on the Pleistocene layers of the cave at Gar Dalam uncovered some teeth that did not match modern human teeth. Or at least 8 of them matched modern human teeth, and then 2 of them did not. In the write-up, these are described as peculiar. And those peculiar teeth were pterodontal molars, and they were found at the 18,000-year-old level. Articles contemporary to their discovery state that they were in the same stages of fossilization as animal bones dated to the same time period. Now, of course, talking about 1917 here, this is different archaeological concepts, different methodology. We're dating mostly by context at this period. The context, of course, would be, all right, well, what else is in that layer? And when's that layer from? You can tell these things through geology. That said, it's probably important to bring up the fact that Arthur Keith, the British anthropologist who was working on analyzing all of this data back in the day, in 1924, said that this was the only evidence of early humans on Malta. That said, he went on to write, in the condition of fossilization and in their morphological characteristics, the molars differ altogether from the other human teeth, specifically noting the other 6 they were found with. He says that they are duplicates of molars found in Jersey, the Isle of Jersey, and Croatia, which are undoubtedly those of Neanderthal man. That's an interesting claim. Back in 1924, we knew a lot less about when exactly Neanderthals died out, so this was not a particularly odd thing to suggest. Also, Keith did take a sample of 2,250 other Neolithic teeth from Malta and compared these 2 molars with pterodontism to all of those teeth and did not find a single other tooth that had those characteristics. And he also writes that that form of pterodontism is unseen in modern humans. Though there is pterodontism in humans, modern humans, there wasn't any of this specific type that he had ever come across. Now, of course, this is a pretty major discovery. If these are Neanderthal teeth, that could push the existence of Neanderthals up by 20,000 years. That could make them much more recent than we thought. But that would be a pretty major paradigm shift, and people are resistant to pretty major paradigm shifts in basically every field. So a lot of archaeologists, a lot of anthropologists have held firm that something's up with where these teeth were found. It's not clear how they got into that context, but they've got to be younger. There's no way that humans were on Malta before 5900 BC. So in 1952 and again in 1968, they attempted to date these teeth with scientific methods, probably with the goal of saying, nope, these teeth are definitely Neolithic. These are definitely from 5900 BC or later. That research remains unpublished, and I must say at this juncture that if the archaeological community is going to, in the first episode, use the fact that Danny Nawajaja's claims are not published, that his research has not been formally peer-reviewed and published, they should not then go and rely on other unpublished works to debunk Graham Hancock. That is unfair and it is hypocritical. So, on the teeth, in my opinion, Graham gets the point, because they were found in context at 18,000 years. No research has been published to change that date, so for the time being, the evidence is on Graham's side. Archaeologists have not revised, and they still maintain that Malta was not inhabited until 5900 BC, which personally, just thinking about it, maybe like permanently settled not until 5900 BC, but it's kind of ridiculous to think that there were no hominids there at any point prior to that when they were all over the rest of Europe. There's really no reason for me to believe that there were Neanderthals in Gibraltar, but not on Malta. That said, it is almost certain that these are specifically archaic Homo sapiens sapiens teeth, because Neanderthals died out 38,000 years ago at the very latest. Or at least they ceased to exist as a distinct and separate species from modern humans. Humans and Neanderthals are related taxonomically in that we share a genus and possibly even a species, but we are certainly different subspecies. This is why, while usually two things have to be the same species to mate and produce fertile children, humans and Neanderthals were able to mate and produce fertile offspring that were, normal. And we know that we interbred with Neanderthals because Europeans and Asians both have a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA still within us to this day. That number ranges anywhere from 1 to 5% depending on the study that you're looking at. Back when I was in college taking anthro courses in 2016, we were looking at that this was 4 to 5% in Europeans and 1 to 3% in Asians, but since then it seems that this has been kind of reframed and now it's a lower percentage in Europeans and about 5% max in Asians with a very small percentage in Africans. And the general belief regarding Africans and why they have Neanderthal DNA is actually that humans, Cro-Magnon, Homo sapiens, went from Africa to Europe and then came back after interbreeding with the Neanderthals, not that there was ever a ton of coexistence between African humans and Neanderthals. But this is where things with the teeth get interesting, because Mifsud claims that he paid to have top-notch, top-of-the-line archaeologists, anthropologists study these teeth, and that all three of them came back and said, these are Neanderthal teeth. So how could they be Neanderthal teeth if they're only 18,000 years old? Well, I thought that was kind of a weird statement for the show, and I know that there have been times where Graham's producers have cut certain things out from conversations to make these conversations look a little bit more compelling, so I went and I read the paper myself. Now, I'll preface what I'm about to say by telling you that I am not an anthropologist or an archaeologist, so sometimes when I read these papers, there are terms that I don't particularly understand. But I would counter any criticism of that by informing you that Graham Hancock and Anton Mifsud are also not trained archaeologists, so I think we're about on the same level here. But what I understood from the paper was not that it concluded that these were Neanderthal teeth, but rather that they concluded these weren't modern human teeth and some more research needed to be done because these could be archaic humans. Whether or not they're Neanderthal, on the other hand, that's up for debate. And part of the reason that Mifsud may be a little bit more inclined to believe that 18,000-year-old teeth could belong to Neanderthals is that a lot of the research he's operating with in the paper he wrote is from the 1990s, when it was believed that Neanderthals had existed in Gibraltar until about 32,000 years ago, which would mean that 18,000 years is still a stretch. That's 14,000 years that needs to be made up. But if we're talking about an isolated population, we know that mammoths died out on the mainland 10,000 years ago. Some of them lasted until about 4,000 years ago on an island off the coast of Alaska. I also might have those dates mixed up. It might be 10,000 BC and 4,000 BC. Not the exact topic of the video. I didn't even write this into my notes. It just popped into my head right now. The reason I bring this up is that more research was eventually carried out on the remains of Neanderthals in Gibraltar, and it was determined that they probably dated to 42 to 38,000 years ago, not 32,000 years ago. So archaeology is actually moving the extinction of Neanderthals back, not forward. So in order for those to be Neanderthal teeth, there would have had to be an entire population of Neanderthals existing in basically in complete isolation on Malta for 20,000 years longer than they lived anywhere else. Currently, there's no archaeological evidence of that. We have not found the remains of Neanderthals. Neanderthals also weren't as primitive as they're often believed, as the common person who doesn't have an education in this might think. They were capable of small levels of, I wouldn't call it industry necessarily, but they weren't, walking around in caves with clubs and just grunting. They were capable of making very hot fires. They were capable of crafting tools. These were intelligent people. And the reason I say that is that if you had a group of them living on Malta for 20,000 years longer than anybody else, you would expect to see material cultural remains. You would expect to find some forms of the jewelry we know they used. For example, we have found holes drilled through seashells, which we believe they used as necklaces. So there should be more evidence that there were Neanderthals there, if there were Neanderthals there for that long. But to Mifsud's credit, he's not saying there was a population of Neanderthals on Malta 18,000 years ago. He's saying there's some weird evidence that suggests there were Neanderthals on Malta 18,000 years ago, and we need to do more work to excavate, which I can absolutely get behind. Mifsud closes by saying this is evidence of human activity during the Ice Age, and until that research on the teeth is published, I'm inclined to agree that yes, this is evidence of human activity on Malta during the Ice Age. I'm not on board with Neanderthals. But the point of that entire segment of the episode is to inform you that there is evidence, however scarce, that 5900 date, that's probably wrong. But surely we're going to have more than just some teeth found in a cave, right? There's got to be something else implying to us that people were doing stuff on that island, and if we're talking about Gigantia and people building that a long time before it was previously thought, there's going to be evidence of those people doing those things. So for that, Graham directs us to what are known as cart ruts. And according to Graham, there are over 35 kilometers of these cart ruts crisscrossing the Isles of Malta. And they're carved directly into the limestone bedrock. This is not, just on top of silt or something like that, really soft stone. Now granted, limestone is not the hardest stone out there. In fact, it's pretty soft by comparison to diamonds, of course. But it still would take a lot of effort and a lot of people moving carts over that limestone to dig grooves like that into the dust, into the solid dirt. And in some cases, these ruts actually go right up to the water line, into the water. And then Graham also believes that he himself has seen some off the coast, about a kilometer off the coast, and 25 meters underwater. And to his credit, he has the footage to show us. It's pretty limited, it's not a ton, and I'll admit it's not super convincing, but you can see the similarities between some of these underwater formations and what's on land. And he believes that these ruts, which he notes that archaeologists agree largely were man-made, are older than the 2,600 years ago they're given. Now, some archaeologists have argued for natural formations such as Zamet in 1918 and Sagana in 2004, but the overwhelming view has been that the ruts are the result of anthropogenic activity, and that is from Hugh Grucut in the Journal of Archaeological Science in the year 2022. In Grocut's paper, he finds that these are pretty uniform widths between the ruts, and that this was probably caused by carts, and that all of the cart ruts on the island were likely formed around the same time, and then possibly reused throughout the ages. But as far as the many studies that have gone into these ruts, there are a range of possibilities. The methods of formation include gradual erosion by wheeled carts or deliberate carving in order to make travel easier. But given the technology of the time and how hard it would be to cut limestone, it's probable that that second one is not true. That it was more likely that these were erosion, not tooled marks. Now there are other suggestions, like a religious purpose, which was Arnaz Villena in 2018, or that they were created as water channels, which was again Sagona, and that one was in 2015. The Sagona suggestion was that these were meant to irrigate and create better farmland. But that one's pretty fringe. Now, what I find interesting is that these cart ruts are relatively uniform in their dimensions, which suggests some standardization of cart size and how these things were being built, which then suggests specialization of labor. Specialization of labor, of course, is typically something that occurs after agriculture, so if these things were built 2,600 years ago, 2,600 BC, either one, then you know what? That's after agriculture. That's long after agriculture. That's not weird at all. But it does give us an idea when agriculture developed over there. So regardless of exactly when these were built, it tells us something about the status of Maltese society at that time and the fact that you must have had artisans. The wheel, however, was invented independently in a number of places throughout time, so it doesn't necessarily imply any sort of trade network. But what's odd here is that Graham claims that the ruts have never been seriously studied. There are a lot of studies, once again, going all the way back to 1918, and Graukut's paper cites a lot of them. So the only thing I can think that he might be talking about is specifically the ruts that go underwater, and that those haven't been seriously studied, which he is right about if that's what he's saying, but if he's saying that people simply haven't looked to study these cart ruts, he's wrong. But if it's the case that he's saying, well, the underwater ones have never really been studied, I'm having a little bit of trouble myself. When Graham said that he has dived and looked at these cart ruts that are a kilometer offshore and 25 meters underwater, he doesn't provide a source or a location for what he's talking about. As for the tracks that he shows running into the water, these are at Birzabugia, and the archaeological community has suggested that those probably are Bronze Age. The reason that they would go underwater is that the sea level has risen since 1000 BC. And Dr. David Trump, an archaeologist who is an expert in the field of Bronze Age Malta, has said that there are Bronze Age silo pits for grain that just go along those cart ruts, and those were above water at some point, so the cart ruts probably were Bronze Age. Is it possible that the cart ruts were already there and the silos were built later? Yeah. Did Graham provide evidence of that? No. Also, some people have noted that some of these cart ruts go off of cliffs, but they don't pick up at the bottom of the cliffs. So it's believed that these were cliffs that collapsed. But to his credit, Graham does show footage of what he believes are cart ruts 25 meters underwater. And if he's correct about that, then cart ruts 25 meters underwater and a kilometer offshore, that's a serious problem for our current dating. I believe he might be talking about a site called Jebel Jol Bahar, which is off the coast of Malta and is 19 meters deep. It's located off of St. Julian's, which is a town near Valletta, Malta, and it was discovered, or identified, I should say, by a man named Hubert Zeitelmeier. It's largely rejected as being any sort of anthropogenic site by archaeologists. But Zeitelmeier claims it contains man-made boulders, 3 stone circles with rooms that each have a diameter of 10 meters and a height of up to 10 meters with an avenue leading down the center. The site sits at a depth of 19 meters, as I said, and it is set up on a plateau measuring 900 by 500 meters. So before any archaeologists in the comments get upset with me, I do want to point out that Zeitelmeier is not a good resource. He's a devotee of Zechariah Sitchin, and Sitchin is known as the guy who tried to teach himself cuneiform and biblical Hebrew and failed horrifically. So I do want to point out I am aware that Zeitelmeier is a total ancient aliens guy, and I read up on some of his opinions. They're wild, and I know who Sitchin is, and I don't like Sitchin myself. I just wanted to get all of that out of the way. That said, I'm of the firm belief that if somebody finds something and presents it as evidence, then you can't just say, well, you like this stupid person, so you're wrong. No, if you come to me with evidence, I'm not going to dismiss it just because I dislike you. And the reason I say this is because that's where the criticism I was able to find of Zeitelmeier and of this Jebel Jol Bahar site in general ends. That is, I could not find any actual criticism of the site. Basically, what it amounts to, from what is publicly available on the internet and through JSTOR and things like that, is, well, we know that Malta wasn't inhabited until 5900 BC, so it can't be. It can't be man-made. And this disconnect between people who, I hesitate to use this term because I guess I'm including myself in it, but Atlantis truthers and the archaeological community, the skeptics, the disconnect there is massive, and it's the same thing over and over and over again, which is somebody on the Atlantis was real side comes forward and says, hey, look at this thing we found. This proves Atlantis. The archaeological community goes, you silly fool, Atlantis wasn't real, and that is the extent of the discussion. And I'm not going to tell you that that is the only type of discussion that ever happens here, but for the most part, that seems to be what you see out there. I think we had a great discussion with Milo, Mini Minuteman, on our own channel about not just this series, but the concept of Atlantis and antediluvian civilization as a whole. I would recommend going and checking that out. I think he's a very intelligent young man, and I look forward to working with him as our careers grow in the future. But if we're getting back to the big-time archaeologists, the guys who are having the argument over Malta at the academic level, the citations regarding why it can't be a temple complex basically all run back to a guy named Ruben Grima. Ruben Grima visited the site, and I believe he's high up. He's a PhD. He's, I believe, in charge of one of the National Maltese History Museums. I didn't do a full bio on the guy. At least I didn't write down the full bio on the guy. Probably should have. But he visited the site in 2015, and the only thing I could find that he said about it was that he was unconvinced that it was man-made. To me, that is simply not enough. And I looked. Some things cited a professional opinion written by him, but I couldn't find the professional opinion. And everything that I read that was citing him just reeked of academic elitism. And I wonder how these people would explain what exactly is wrong with the suggestion that this was a man-made site to somebody who isn't claiming that aliens or Atlantis built it, and rather somebody who's saying, is it possible that this was a Neolithic civilization, society, whatever term you want to use, that existed and was eventually forced up onto higher ground by rising sea levels? But instead, everything goes back to Atlantis isn't real, not actually explaining why the site isn't man-made. Someone said that there were some illegal boulders dumped there, which just does not remotely explain enough. And I will be perfectly honest, I looked at the pictures that I could find of this site, and I am inclined to agree with Ruben Grima that this is not a man-made site. But on the other hand, the fact that he said no, and at no point did anybody decide to go out and do an actual attempt at a survey, that bugs me. And the fact that that's being used to say Graham's wrong instead of some sort of actual argument, just, oh, well, this one guy said, I'm unconvinced, therefore Graham Hancock is wrong. I don't like that. I think it's hypocritical. I do not like that. It is a complete double standard that Graham is required to provide concrete, explicit, undeniable evidence of his beliefs, but the archaeological community can just say, doesn't really jive. But Graham's next point takes us back above water and onto the temple grounds. Namely, we're looking at Menasra, which is the only temple on Malta that is oriented towards the sun. And it's actually a pretty ingenious design because the front entrance on the equinoxes is perfectly flooded with light at sunrise. And then on the solstices, the way the sun works its way in perfectly illuminates just one side of the temple. And of course, which side that is switches based on which solstice you're looking at. And Graham is completely correct in saying that this is the only temple that is known to point towards the sun. The other temples on Malta do not point towards the sun, and in fact, the only real direction they all point is south, and not due south, but just generally somewhere between east and west. Lower, though. Now, while a lot of people would look at it and say, all right, well, maybe they just chose to face their temples south, Graham thinks that there was a reason they chose to face them all south. He says that whoever built Menasra had an advanced understanding of the cosmos. This is where he brings back Katja Stroud, who confirms that yes, they did pay attention to the stars, and yes, they did pay attention to the rising of the sun. And to give you what Graham specifically said about the solstices, it was, the sun precisely illuminates the edges of the megaliths to the left and right of the doorway. Either Graham or his producers left out the coolest part, which is the series of holes drilled into a stone to track the phases of the moon so they could tell what time of year it was. Their calendar was lunar-based. That just doesn't get mentioned. I think that's cool. But since all of the other temples don't align with the sun, the question is fair to ask, what do they align with, or do they align with anything? For this, Graham brings on Lenny Rajic, who used software to track the positions of stars in the sky and to try and line those up with the orientation of the other temples on Malta. And her conclusion, in her book that she published in 2018, was that all of these temples at some point were aligned with the star Sirius. The The reason the temples aren't all oriented in the same exact direction is that Sirius, because of precession, which is the way that the Earth wobbles on its own axis and therefore seems to change the position of the stars in the sky, Sirius would vary by a degree or so every 72 years. So Graham's point is that if the temples were directed towards Sirius, then their positions, their orientations would change over time. Therefore, it makes sense to make this claim. He says, over the centuries, their alignment would shift just as we've seen on Malta. But the official timeline places all of the Maltese temples as being built after 3600 BC, which causes a bit of a problem. And unfortunately, Ancient Apocalypse doesn't actually tell us what year and which temple lined up with Sirius, or what period and what temple lined up with Sirius. If it's consistent over a period of just a few thousand years, that's pretty interesting. If it's kind of random over the course of 20,000 years, that's less helpful. But Graham suggests that this explains why they built so many temples. They would need a new temple every time Sirius moved out of view. But the thing is, you'd think they would devise a different kind of temple in that case, rather than just building new ones over and over again. I mean, this is a pretty intense feat. This is the kind of thing that people typically do because they're worshiping a divine being, not because they're tracking the movement of a star. And if practicality was the reason they were tracking the movement of the star, you would think that they would have devised a different system and maybe even used wood, which is considerably easier to move. But then Graham does give us a little bit of a clue to his thinking here, which is that Sirius wasn't visible from Malta until about 11,000 years ago. So all of these temples have to have been built more recently than that. And he tells us that the temple that is best aligned to where Sirius would have been 11,000 years ago is Hagar-Im North. The problem is that temple is typically dated to the Gigantia phase, which runs from 3600 to 3200 BC, and this is one of the phases of the Maltese megalithic temple complex buildings. Now, Hagar-Im is one of the smallest and simplest of the temples, as is said in the show, but Lenny actually contradicts Graham in saying that it's the oldest one. At the beginning of the episode, Graham said that Gigantia was the oldest one, and at no point throughout the episode does he ever walk that back. But he also doesn't argue with her here, and the episode suggests that Gigantia is actually the youngest of the temples, and that's what Lenny kind of says. So Lenny's theory, or I should call it a hypothesis really, Lenny's hypothesis pushes back the date of settlement by 3,100 years at the least, and it also reverses the chronology of when the temples were built. And a little needs to be said about Lenny Regic because source analysis is important, and while I'm not of the mind that you must be an educated, trained historian to contribute to the field of history meaningfully, it is an important thing to look at, all right, well, who is this person? What's their background? Might they have an agenda? And how good are their citations, their sources, and their arguments? Lenny had undergraduate studies in English and German, and she has published a book, but she has never published any academic or peer-reviewed literature. The book that's actually immediately in question here is Sirius, the Star of the Temples of Malta, and that was written again, that came out in 2018. If you want to go check it out, go for it. I actually wanted to order it and read it, but you can't get it on Amazon Prime, and I couldn't find it locally, so it would have taken a month to get here. I just didn't have the time. From what I can tell, though, from what is available online, including the preview of the book that she has on her own website, her entire argument seems to be based around Sirius. So she ends up redating temples on Malta, not based on carbon dating or artifacts found in context, anything like that. Instead, she redates all of the temples based entirely upon when Sirius would have been in front of them. And while I haven't read the book, her appearance on the show and the way she talks about it does suggest that yes, that is her point. Ironically, one of the reviews of the book that was on the website was written by a Noel Grima, which is, of course, the same last name as Ruben Grima, who had a very different opinion. I can't say that they're related, it might just be a common name down there. I just thought that was funny. And in reading what was available of Lenny's book on her website, she does definitely have experience with academic writing. She understands the concept, but her sources are dubious. As I said, the book was released in 2018, but it cites Dr. David Trump writing in 2002 when he said that there weren't a ton of carbon dating samples for these temples. The thing is, from 2009 on, others, such as A. Malone et al., did more studies and did more meta-analysis and looked at the samples they had, and eventually they compiled and analyzed 155 carbon dating samples. And Malone's work, as I said, was ongoing for decades, so it seems that she just wasn't keeping up with the most recent scholarship. Obviously, I'm not making that claim just based off of one citation, but this is throughout the text. So in my opinion, from what I have read, and I'm happy to buy the book and change my opinion later, but from what I've read, her work simply doesn't account for the holes that exist. It doesn't explain why there is no material culture older than 3600 BC at these temple sites. It doesn't explain why Gigantia and Hagarim North are reversed in dating. There's just a number of issues with it that if you're looking at the Sirius angle, sure, this makes a lot of sense, but you've got to leave a lot of context out in order for that to be a clear-cut explanation. Graham then pulls us back a little bit more towards folklore and international relations by telling us that, you know what, Sirius is also associated with ancient Egypt. And the way it's associated with ancient Egypt is in the association with the flooding of the Nile, which is very much true because Sirius would be present in the sky in the same place relatively the same time every time the Nile flooded every year. And he also says that Sirius was associated with the goddess Isis. That's iffy. Yes, at some point, Sirius was associated with Isis, but this is where I think Graham's lack of, oh God, how am I going to say this? I'm trying to say this in a really polite way, but Graham's lack of familiarity with history comes back to bite him, because Sirius was originally associated with Sopdet, who was eventually syncretized with Isis by the Greeks. So Sirius not originally associated with Isis, and the reason he brings up Isis is to bring up Osiris, and to connect Osiris to Quetzalcoatl, and connecting Osiris to Quetzalcoatl is because Osiris is a civilizing figure and then leaves to go off and help other nations around the world civilize. And well, we saw that too with Quetzalcoatl because he leaves and then they were expecting him to come back, and that's why they got confused with Cortez and all of that. But he gets the Quetzalcoatl one wrong, and we went over that in the last episode, so you can go check that out if you want to. But the short explanation is that Quetzalcoatl is actually a creator figure who is there from the beginning. He is one of the primordial sons of the primordial gods. He is one of the original Aztec Mexica gods. And he doesn't leave to go civilize other nations. He's not driven out. He is tricked, and then he ends up burning himself upon a pyre or going across the ocean. There's no prophecy of him returning that I could find. He also brings up the Eye of Horus, which is commonly on Maltese fishing boats. The thing is, Egypt is not the only civilization in the region that used a symbol like the Eye of Horus. We have a number of other ones, and also the Eye of Horus was adopted by a whole bunch of other seafaring nations like the Greeks, the Romans, the Carthaginians, the Phoenicians. Also, there's no extant examples of the Eye of Horus in any of the temples or any of the material culture until we have colonists from the Eastern Mediterranean around 800 BC. That's when it starts to pop up on Malta, which strongly suggests that the Eye of Horus was brought to Malta by Phoenician colonists. And then Graham says something that I actually like, which is it possible that such myths, so similar in so many different cultures, might even be traced back to a single source? I will say it. I've said it since I started talking about Graham Hancock's work 2 years ago, and I will continue to say it now. I think Graham Hancock is asking the right questions. I think he's coming to the wrong conclusions because he's choosing poor evidence. In his version of events, he suggests that while our hunter-gatherer ancestors were busy surviving the Ice Age, someone else was circumnavigating the globe. If you are going based on what Graham has said, then this does track. And if you believe Graham is a true believer in his work, as I do, then I think Graham is telling the truth, just not the facts. I think he means what he says. I think he believes what he says is accurate, so I don't think he's lying. I don't think he's grifting. I think that he simply has some of the wrong information, and once you've been doing this for so long, it's often hard to confront your original beliefs that might now seem incorrect to you. It's hard to do that. It's the exact same criticism that I have leveled over at the archaeological community, and ironically, the same criticism that Graham has for the archaeological community. The problem I have is that he seems all too willing to accept commonalities, between different religious and folkloric traditions without doing the proper level of scrutiny, and he's often doing this where he brings Quetzalcoatl and Osiris together, and they're just not the same figure. So he's seeing commonalities in myths where they don't exist, but the problem is that the archaeological community has the opposite problem. They see no commonalities where they are absolutely there. So once again, I do have to point out that I think the big issue here really is the disconnect in communication between the two sides. As far as the episode overall, in my opinion, this is one of Graham's weakest pieces of work. Throughout the episode, he fails to account for precisely when things happened. A major aspect of this that I took issue with is that Malta has been populated and repopulated over and over again many, many times. It has been controlled by the Phoenicians, Carthaginians, Vandals, Byzantines, the Arab Aghlabids, the Normans, the Sicilians, the French, the Knights Hospitaller, the French again, the English, and then they finally achieved independence in 1956. And that's not including the Neolithic people who were already there. A lot of cultural mixing went on in Malta, and Graham really doesn't account for any of it. Graham also leans too much on mythology in this episode, in my opinion, given the liberties he takes with the stories of Sansuna and Quetzalcoatl. As I said, he simply got the Quetzalcoatl story wrong, and Sansuna seems almost certainly to have been brought over by either the Phoenicians or the Arabs. And I really want to stress exactly how little information on Sansuna there is out there. There's a couple of books that were written a while ago, and then there's some vague references to this goddess in feminist history literature. And that's not a dig, feminist history is actually a school of history, just in case. Mention of Neanderthal teeth also is frustrating to me because Graham does nothing to pose the argument, hey, wait a second, Neanderthals are supposed to have gone extinct 40,000 years ago, you're saying 18,000 years, how do you explain that gap? He does not make that push. So either Neanderthals lasted a hell of a lot longer in Malta than they did anywhere else, or those teeth ended up in the wrong context somehow. And a major issue with this episode is the lack of any material culture. Almost all the sites that Graham mentions only show one layer of deposition, which means that it seems like they were only ever used by one cultural group. You would expect that if this was an area that was inhabited by an entire civilization, there would be material culture from that civilization, not just the temple complexes. And we don't seem to have any. And the fact there's only one deposition at each one really is not good for Graham's claim that the reason we have recent artifacts is that there were later invasions and people came in and started reusing these buildings. So for his own part, Graham presents no evidence that there is a material culture going back 11,000 years. And as for the cart ruts, he says that they haven't been studied, but I just disagree with that. There's a large body of work on those cart ruts, and he also doesn't quite show some sites that would suggest things are a little different than he suggests they are, which are like quarries that seem to have cart ruts leading out of them. So I just think that's not a fair assessment of the existing scholarship. But Graham isn't the only one doing poorly here. As I mentioned a few times, Ruben Grima's opinion seems to be completely unexplained, or if it was explained, it was kept within the ivory tower and not produced for everybody else, at least not in any legitimately accessible way. I looked all over JSTOR, ResearchGate, couldn't find anything. He said he was unconvinced that Jebel Jol Bahar was a man-made site, but I found no evidence that he ever actually investigated it, or at least not that he thoroughly investigated it. All citations go back to a professional opinion he wrote that is not publicly accessible, and saying I'm unconvinced and then not elaborating further, especially in an age when you can write a blog post from your phone, is thoroughly unconvincing in and of itself. Then there's the teeth again. Those arguing that the teeth are not as old as their context suggests, 18,000 years, have failed to publish any research. Since they have not produced any of their research, the only evidence regarding those teeth is that they were found at a layer that was 18,000 years old, and that they have a taurodontism not seen in modern men, modern humans. So, the evidence that is currently made available does in fact suggest those teeth are 18,000 years old. That is not me saying that the teeth are 18,000 years old, it's just me saying archaeologists have failed to present solid evidence that they're not. The claim they're making is they're not, and the teeth were found in context at 18,000 years, therefore it's on them to say, no, these teeth are not 18,000 years old. That said, it probably would help if Mifsud could produce some evidence that they are 18,000 years old, aside from just the context. Context is solid, but it's not definitive at all times. And again, these are my opinions as a historian, not as an archaeologist. So once again, my point here, I guess, is, and this always ends up being my point every time I do a Graham Hancock video, is if archaeologists are going to require Graham to present evidence of his beliefs, then they need to present their own evidence as well, because they often fail to do so and think they can get away with just being like, nah, that's ridiculous. Here's my degree. Like, no, that's not how it works. And also, let's say Graham is completely wrong. Let's say this was the dangerous evil conspiracy theory they all say it is. I have some pretty personal experience in what happens when you try to debunk a conspiracy theory, present evidence, and then it's deemed not enough evidence, so you present more evidence. These people are not doing that. They are simply saying, no, I have a degree, you don't, there we go. That does not change people's minds, especially when you're deep down the conspiracy rabbit hole. You can show people all the evidence necessary that, I don't know, Philadelphia City Hall actually was constructed in the late 1800s and was finished in the early 1900s, and that you have pictures of it before it was built, during it being built, and immediately after it was built. And you can have people who actually remembered that it was being built up until like 30 years ago, and the Tartarians will still tell you you're wrong. So, I want anybody who's in the archaeological community who sees this, who has power, I want you guys to really understand how entrenched conspiracy theorists are, and the fact that you're gonna need to go out of your way if you want to get them to stop. If you want them to stop making their claims, you have to concretely prove them wrong. Otherwise, it will never end. And the goal really shouldn't even be to prevent, to change people's minds who are already in there. It should be to find the people who are kind of on the fence and reach them and be like, here, hey, here's the information that you're missing. Here you go. It shouldn't just be, hey, nobody watch this. This should be banned. This is wrong. Because you know what that does? It makes you look like you're censoring. It makes you look like the bad guy, and you do it all the time, so stop. And I think my last point here is to everybody involved. If we're looking for Atlantis, we should be looking underwater, not on land. But I did have one thought while I was watching it, which was, how can we make sense of 18,000-year-old teeth and structures being built when they were, and something that's off in the ocean? And what I thought was this cave, Gar Dalam, that is supposed to be the first place that we have evidence of human inhabitation of Malta. What if Gar Dalam wasn't where they went when they first got there? What if they were on the lower parts, those flooded, and they went further up? There was a flooding event around, it's either 7,600 years ago or 7,600 BC, again, off the top of my head, that flooded the northern Aegean, about a meter of sea level rise. Is it so ridiculous to think that that also might have happened around Malta? I don't think so. And we are discovering these little things fairly often. So to say that it's impossible that there were people on Malta earlier, to say that it's impossible that there were temples built older than the ones that are currently there that are now submerged, is a little ridiculous in my opinion, but I'm not gonna sit here and tell you that there's strong evidence that they are there. Just, there's enough circumstantial stuff that I'm interested. And I wish that somebody with the means, like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates, any of the billionaires out there, would take an interest and go, you know what, I can shovel a few million towards this to pay for an excavation. Because at that point, you got enough money, man. Like, find something cool for the rest of us. You get to go to space, Jeff. Let me find Atlantis. Anyway, if you like support what we're doing here at the Lore Lodge, you can subscribe on Patreon for just $1. You can also check us out here on YouTube for a membership that will give you an ad-free experience for $5 a month. And if you want to buy merch from us, we do have it. It is cool. I designed it. I also designed our coffee. You can get the merch at thelorelodge.shop. You can get the coffee from Tableau Roasting Company. Both are linked in the description. You can also check out these conversations live on Sunday nights at 7 p.m. Those are discussion-based. They are Q&A. That's really, I think, what people come for is the Q&A part. But idea behind it is you can check those out. You can also catch them on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google, anything you listen to podcasts on. And if you want to join the Discord, it is bit.ly/jointhelodge, where you can have conversations with other fans of the channel. And if you like this content, but you want to see it about history, I guess this was kind of about history, or about the Bible, okay, this was kind of both, you can go check out the History Hut or the Weird Bible. With all that said, I am Aiden Mattis, and thank you for stopping by the Lore Lodge.